Banned from Dad's party for looking poor, then I was called the boss. It sounds like the kind of twist you'd find in a movie. But for me, it was the night everything I believed about effort, loyalty, and family shattered in one sharp, quiet moment. That was the night I realized the people closest to me were more concerned about how I looked walking through the door than the years I spent building everything behind it. My name is Mariah Riddle Sprigger. I'm 33 years old, and I live in Chicago. I run a private logistics consultancy that powers supply chains for some of the most recognizable consumer brands in the U.S. fashion houses, pharmaceutical labs, even global nonprofits. We don't advertise. We don't put our name on trucks. That's by design. We solve the problems no one wants to admit they have. And we do it invisibly. It's not glamorous work, but it's real. And for most of my life, I thought real was enough. I grew up in Milwaukee in a working-class family. My father, Maurice Riddle Sprigger, owned a concrete and foundation business that he started with his younger brother after high school. My mother, Ella, was a math teacher who believed in rules, routines, and Sunday night family meetings. I was the youngest, quiet, observant, always organized. My older brother Marcus was the opposite, loud, charming, effortlessly magnetic. Everyone said he had star quality. Dad used to say he was the kind of guy people wanted to follow. Marcus never liked numbers, never stuck to one idea too long, and rarely finished anything he started. But it didn't matter. He had presence. That was enough. By the time I was 24, I had a degree in systems engineering and had returned home to help Dad modernize the business. The accounting was a mess. The scheduling was still on paper. Payroll happened when someone remembered. I didn't overhaul it overnight. I just showed up, quietly. I rebuilt the workflow, automated procurement, optimized bidding timelines, and moved payroll into a real system. In 2 years, margins improved by 38%. I never asked for recognition. I thought results would speak for themselves. I was wrong. When local business media wrote a feature about how Riddle Sprigger Construction had become one of the most efficient mid-size contractors in the tri-state area. Marcus gave the interview. He said the secret was agility and vision. Dad stood behind him, nodding like every word was gospel. My name wasn't mentioned once, but I stayed, because I thought loyalty meant staying quiet. I thought if I kept delivering, eventually they'd see me. They didn't. When my father announced he was stepping down, I was in the office at 7:30 a.m., managing the 4th project Marcus had handed off incomplete. I assumed Dad would at least ask me to consider stepping up. Instead, he told the whole team at a Friday lunch that Marcus would take over as CEO. I was sitting right there. Mariah will support behind the scenes like she always does, he added, like that was a compliment. I didn't speak. I just smiled and nodded, because I had trained myself too. The retirement party was set for early spring. In a rented ballroom at the Westmount Club, mahogany walls, valet-only entrance, champagne fountains, the whole thing. The invitation said formal attire, black tie optional. I wore a navy jumpsuit, structured, elegant, pressed to perfection, no sequins, no loud labels. I pulled my hair into a sleek knot, wore the same gold studs my mom gave me when I graduated high school, and drove myself when I arrived. I gave my name at the front. The woman with the list barely glanced at me before asking if I was with the caterers. I corrected her, and she gave a tight smile. Oh, your family, I see. We're actually asking support guests to use the side entrance. It's a policy for tonight's event. My stomach dropped, but my face didn't move. I said nothing. I stepped aside. I walked back to my car. I sat in the parking lot, looking at the building lit up like a showroom. I knew what was happening inside. Toasts, speeches, Marcus being called the future, and me, outside, not even worth verifying on the guest list. That was the moment I realized I wasn't just being overlooked, I was being erased. I didn't cry. I didn't try to explain myself. I sat there, in silence, and made a decision. I wasn't going to fight for visibility anymore. I wasn't going to beg to be seen. I was going to build something so strong, so necessary, that when they finally looked up, I wouldn't be asking to be let in. I'd be holding the keys to the building. After I left the parking lot that night, I didn't go home right away. I didn't even know where I was going. I just drove around the city in silence. No music, no navigation, just the hum of the engine and the sound of my own breathing. I kept replaying the moment in my head, her words, her tone, the way she didn't even bother to double-check the list. She had decided who I was based on a glance. And the worst part, she wasn't wrong to assume I didn't belong, because I didn't. Not in their world, not in a room where status was currency and packaging mattered more than contribution. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me tired. I pulled into a 24-hour diner on the south side, ordered a black coffee, and stared out the window while a group of night shift nurses laughed at the booth behind me. That used to be my crowd. Women who worked late, who solved real problems, who didn't wear labels to feel seen. I used to think I was working towards something better, but now I wasn't so sure. I had built systems, optimized operations, trained teams, and led deals no one else in my family even knew existed. And for what? So I could be told to use the back entrance at my father's own party the next morning. I woke up before my alarm. I sat on the edge of my bed and made a mental list of every client I'd landed in the last year. I thought of the metrics we'd hit, the warehouses we'd redesigned, the fulfillment network we'd built from scratch that had cut delivery delays by 40% across the Midwest. My work had impact, but I couldn't shake the truth that kept coming back. I had never once celebrated any of it. I had been so focused on being useful, efficient, invisible, that I had erased myself along the way, and my family had taken that erasure as permission to forget I existed. 2 days later, I called my attorney. We'd incorporated my logistics firm 5 years ago as a side entity, originally just a freelance vehicle for extra income when I was still doing back-end operations for Dad's company. But it had grown, quietly, strategically, and now it was time to make it real. Not just functional, visible. I renamed the company Emberlane Logistics. I filed the paperwork to restructure under an S-Corp. I updated the bank accounts, finalized a line of credit with a regional bank I had built a relationship with for 2 years, and reached out to 2 previous clients who had wanted exclusivity, but I had turned down out of loyalty to my family. That loyalty was gone now, not in a bitter way, just released. Marcus called later that week, not to ask if I was okay, not to mention the party, just to ask if I had a copy of the bid proposal for a city contract he couldn't locate. I emailed it to him without comment. He replied, "Thanks, lifesaver." I didn't respond, because I wasn't, not anymore. I started spending weekends at Emberlane's shared office space instead of going to family dinners. No one asked why. No one called. The silence was confirmation of everything I had suspected for years. I was only valuable when I was useful, when I made their lives easier, when I didn't ask for anything in return. But something else happened during those weekends. I started mapping out what Emberlane could become if I stopped playing small. I looked at our core strengths: reverse logistics, last mile optimization, risk mitigation, and realized we had something that mid-sized firms needed but couldn't build internally. I reached out to a few operations directors I had worked with over the years. We scheduled lunch, coffee, quiet conversations in hotel lobbies and airport lounges, and behind the scenes. A new strategy started to take shape. I didn't need validation. I needed traction, and I was already sitting on it, a month after the party. I declined an invitation to Easter brunch. I knew I'd hear comments about how thin I looked, or how tired. Comments that weren't concern, just code for control. Instead, I booked a last-minute flight to Denver to meet with a CEO who ran a clean beauty company struggling with fulfillment delays. We talked for 90 minutes. By the end of the meeting, he handed me a signed contract and said, "You're exactly the kind of operator I've been looking for." That night, I sat in my hotel room, staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly, and whispered aloud for the first time in years, "I'm not invisible." The next morning, I emailed my accountant and asked for a full audit of my family's business financials from the last 2 years, not to expose anything, not to get revenge, but because I had a feeling they were headed for a storm. And for once, I wasn't going to be the one who fixed it in secret. I was going to let it fall. And when they needed help, they were going to have to come through my door. It took them almost 6 weeks to notice I was gone, or at least to pretend they did. Marcus called on a Wednesday afternoon. His voice was chipper, like nothing had happened. He asked if I was coming to Mom's birthday dinner that weekend, said she missed me, said Dad had mentioned how quiet the office felt without me around. I didn't ask whether he meant the family office or the construction business. I just said I had a client meeting in St. Louis and couldn't make it. It wasn't a lie. I had booked the meeting 2 hours before the call just so I could say it. That weekend, they posted a photo of the family at dinner, everyone dressed up, wine glasses in hand, my brother's wife in a new dress, my father smiling, my mother holding the same bouquet of roses I used to buy her every year. There was a gap between Marcus and his wife where I normally sat. I stared at that gap for a long time, not out of sadness, out of recognition. I wasn't being erased anymore. I was removing myself. Meanwhile, Emberlane was growing, not explosively, but steadily. Word spread quietly. One successful contract led to another referral. I didn't chase headlines. I chased broken systems and fixed them. Clients liked that I didn't come in with ego. I came in with frameworks. People who worked with me didn't care how I dressed or what kind of car I drove. They cared that I delivered, on time, under budget, every time, 3 months after the party. Marcus emailed me a spreadsheet with a subject line that simply said, "Help." It was a bid projection for a public works contract in Waukegan. The margins were wrong, the logistics unrealistic, and he had clearly copied the format from a sheet I'd built 2 years earlier. I stared at it for 20 minutes. I didn't reply, not because I wanted him to fail, but because I was done being their safety net. Later that week, I ran into one of our old subcontractors at a logistics expo downtown. He looked surprised to see me there as a speaker, and even more surprised when he saw my name on the program as CEO. He leaned in, chuckled, and said, "I always thought you were just the scheduler." I smiled and said, "I used to be. Now I run the system everyone else depends on." His face changed then, not out of insult, out of recognition. That's when I realized how long I had been shrinking myself to make others comfortable. Back at the family company, things started slipping, quietly at first, delayed invoices, wrong delivery windows. One of Dad's old foremen called me privately and said, "Look, I don't want to get in the middle, but we're not getting paid on time, and Marcus keeps changing specs after crews are on site." I thanked him and told him I wasn't involved anymore. He said, "That's the problem. I could have stepped in, fixed things like I used to, cleaned up the messes before they became crises. But this time, I didn't. Instead, I had lunch with a venture group that was scouting operationally strong logistics firms with steady cash flow. They weren't looking for unicorns. They were looking for real. That's what I was building. Something real. No ego, no headlines. Just a company that did what it promised and did it better than most. Then came the audit. The one I had requested months earlier, mostly out of instinct. The numbers told a familiar story. Declining margins, unpaid retainers, vendor attrition. The business was bleeding slowly, death by 1,000 bad assumptions. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt something quieter, like watching a house settle unevenly after years of ignoring the foundation. Around that time, my father reached out for the first time. He didn't call. He emailed, short, formal, asked if I had time to review some structural concerns with the company. I responded 3 days later, said I was booked solid, but could refer him to someone. I didn't offer my own time. He replied with one sentence, "I'd rather hear it from you." That night, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat by the window of my apartment overlooking the Chicago skyline. I wasn't angry. I wasn't smug. I was just still. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the pull to fix something that wasn't mine anymore. I had let go. And they were starting to feel the weight of that absence. But I knew something else too. They weren't done with me yet. Not when they still thought they had leverage. Not when they believed I was still the girl in the navy jumpsuit who got turned away at the door. They didn't know I had already started buying equity in 2 of their largest vendors. They didn't know that the logistics firm I ran now touched parts of their supply chain they had outsourced for years. And they didn't know I had positioned myself, quietly, calmly, as the only person who could keep their operations from falling apart entirely. The best revenge isn't about proving someone wrong. It's about becoming undeniable without asking for permission. And I wasn't finished yet. The first time Marcus truly sounded nervous. He didn't bother with small talk. It was early on a Tuesday. I was reviewing the final integration checklist for a new client, a medical supplies distributor that had hired us to rebuild their entire fulfillment network after 3 years of chaos. My assistant slid a note onto my desk. "Marcus, line 2, says it's urgent." I let it ring twice more before I picked up. His voice was tight, clipped. "Hey, listen, we've got a situation." I didn't say anything. He continued. "One of our delivery vendors just dropped the contract. They were supposed to handle materials for the Oak Ridge job. You know anybody who can take it over by Friday?" I looked out my office window at the city below. For a brief second, I wondered what version of me he thought he was calling. Did he still picture the girl who sorted his spreadsheets in college, the one who fixed logistics failures at 2 a.m. so he could make it to brunch looking successful? I kept my voice neutral. That's short notice. Most providers won't touch a job mid-cycle. He exhaled. "Yeah, I know. That's why I called you. You've got people." "Right. You always did." There it was, that familiar dynamic. He created the fire. I brought the water, and when the flames died down, he stood in the smoke, arms raised like a hero. But this time, I didn't say yes. I told him I'd think about it. I told him to send me the scope of work, including current liabilities and penalties if the delivery missed the timeline. He paused. "You want the numbers," I said. "Of course I want the numbers. I don't do favors anymore. Marcus, this is business. By noon." The documents landed in my inbox. The job was bigger than he'd described. 2 shipments had already failed inspection. One was sitting at a holding yard with incorrect manifest tags. The replacement vendor had pulled out after realizing the paperwork was a mess and the timeline unrealistic. I could have fixed it. Emberlane had the capacity, but I didn't move immediately. I waited. That afternoon, my legal team updated me on something else. The vendor that dropped Marcus's contract had just signed a strategic partnership with us. They didn't know he was my brother. He didn't know they were now working under my umbrella. The timing wasn't planned, but it was perfect. I asked for a meeting with Marcus and Dad to discuss the Oak Ridge crisis. Not a phone call, a meeting, at my office, Friday, 10 a.m. My father's reply came through first, just one line, "We'll be there," when they arrived. Marcus wore a tight blazer he couldn't quite relax in. My father looked older than I remembered, his jaw tense, eyes scanning the building like he was still trying to understand how I fit here. My conference room was all glass and concrete, clean, efficient, no frills, no gold trim. I didn't offer coffee. I didn't offer nostalgia. I got straight to the numbers. I laid out the state of their delivery breakdown. I showed them how much it had already cost them in penalties. I showed them how much more it would cost if the next shipment failed. Then I showed them a solution. Emberlane would take over the project. We'd absorb the immediate liabilities, correct the documentation, and meet the deadline. But it wouldn't be a handshake deal. It would be a formal service contract, 3 months minimum, full access, full authority, my authority. Marcus looked at Dad. Dad looked at me. And for a moment, no one spoke. Then Marcus said, "So we'd be reporting to you." I nodded. "That's correct. Temporarily, unless you prefer to keep losing vendors." Dad cleared his throat. "I don't love the optics. Family working under family. What would people think?" I looked at him. Steady. "Maybe they'd think you finally trusted the person who's been keeping your business afloat in the background for 10 years. Or maybe they'd think you didn't know how to recognize value until you had to pay for it." The silence was heavier than I expected. Not angry, just hollow. Like two men realizing they had spent a decade polishing the wrong statue. "Eventually," Dad said quietly, "send over the contract that weekend." I went back to the same diner I'd sat in the night of the retirement gala. This time, I brought my laptop, ordered pancakes, and signed the service agreement with one click. The irony didn't escape me. They hadn't invited me to the table then. Now, they had to sit at mine, not out of guilt, not out of love, but because I had built something they needed, and I wasn't done yet. 2 weeks into the Oak Ridge contract, I started receiving emails from my father's employees directly, not through Marcus, not filtered by a third party, just straight messages from foremen, site managers, procurement leads, questions about timing, clarification on documentation, confirmations of delivery. Most of them addressed me as Ms. Riddlesprigger. A few wrote Mariah and added a small note at the end that said something like, "Thanks for jumping in." I didn't respond with long messages, just precise answers, clear, calm, professional, the way I always operated. The only difference was that now they were finally seeing it. Marcus, to his credit, didn't interfere, whether it was guilt, confusion, or fear of losing the deal. I couldn't tell, but for once, he stayed out of the way. I wasn't cruel to him. I wasn't cold. I just stopped translating myself. If he didn't understand something, I let silence do the explaining. If he dropped the ball, I didn't chase after it. I simply moved without him. Dad showed up to one of the logistics meetings unannounced. He stood in the back of the room for 20 minutes without speaking. Just watched as I walked the client through risk tiers, scheduling pivots, and transit velocity analysis. When the meeting ended, he followed me to my office and sat down across from my desk without invitation. "You've changed," he said, not accusingly, more like he was trying to solve a puzzle. "No," I said. "You just stopped ignoring what was always there." He didn't respond, just looked at the floor and nodded once. That evening, I drove back to my apartment and passed by the Westmount Club, the same building where, months earlier, I had been told I wasn't dressed appropriately to walk through the front door. The building hadn't changed, but I had. I wasn't chasing access anymore. I was choosing where I belonged. The Oak Ridge contract was completed 5 days ahead of schedule. We cut delivery failure rates in half, corrected every compliance issue, and under-budgeted projections. When I submitted the final report, I attached a short message. This concludes the terms of our temporary engagement. Thank you for your cooperation. It wasn't meant to sound cold. It was meant to be clear. Boundaries, finally drawn with the weight they always should have had. 3 hours later, I got a calendar invite from my father. Subject line lunch. Just us. We met at a quiet restaurant on the lake. Not our usual family spot. Somewhere new, neutral. He arrived early, already seated, already waiting. I didn't order food, just coffee. He asked about the contract. I gave him the numbers. Then I waited. He finally said it. You saved us. Not like a compliment, more like a confession. I nodded. Then he said the line I hadn't expected. I didn't know how far you'd come. I looked him in the eye and told him the truth. I came this far because you never expected me to. There was no big apology, no tears, just silence. Then he said something simple. I was wrong about a lot of things. That was enough. The following week, I got a call from a supplier who had been with our family company for over a decade. He said he'd heard Emberlane was growing, and if I ever needed private routing on the East Coast, he'd make space. I asked if he'd had this number the whole time. He chuckled. Always. Just never thought you'd answer. And there it was again. Not anger, not revenge, just reality catching up to truth. The shift wasn't public. There were no social media posts, no grand reveals, just a quiet, undeniable movement of respect finally beginning to shift toward where it always should have been. Not because I demanded it, because I earned it, again and again. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the final act. My father was still navigating discomfort. My brother was still uncertain where he stood. And the business, while momentarily stabilized, was not prepared for what was coming next. There was still one decision I hadn't made, one boundary I hadn't drawn, one truth I hadn't said out loud yet, and they had no idea what was coming. About a month after we wrapped the Oak Ridge contract, I got an email from a private equity group based in New York. They were assembling a portfolio of high-efficiency logistics firms with clean operations, strong cash flow, and high client retention. Emberlane was on their short list. They requested a meeting. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I forwarded the message to my CFO and asked for a full audit of our internal valuation. I wasn't thinking about selling. I just wanted to know what we were worth. Not theoretically, objectively. The number that came back was higher than I expected, substantially higher. We had built something lean, resilient, and remarkably profitable for a company so young, quietly, efficiently, without headlines, and now the world was starting to notice. A few days later, the equity group followed up with a proposal, not to acquire, to invest, 40% stake, 7-figure buy-in, scaled growth strategy, full founder control. I didn't say yes, but I didn't say no either. The night I got the offer, I went to visit my mother. She had been texting more often lately, not about business, just casual things, a new restaurant opening, a photo of my niece learning how to ride a bike. It felt like she was trying to keep a connection open without addressing what had shifted beneath all of us. I let her. I wasn't ready to untangle the emotional part yet. We sat in her kitchen. She poured tea into mugs we'd had since I was a teenager. I asked about her garden. She asked if I was seeing anyone. We danced around the obvious until she finally said it. Your father's been quieter lately. He's been thinking. I waited. She continued about how things went, about you, about all the years he didn't see what was right in front of him. I looked at her, calm. Did he say that? She nodded slowly. Not in those words. But I know him. I can tell. I didn't know what to do with that information. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even accountability. But it was a start, a shift, a signal that the story they had been telling themselves for so long might finally be cracking open. I told her I might be expanding Emberlane, that outside capital was interested. She looked surprised, but not shocked. You've always done more than you let on, she said. That was her version of pride. I accepted it. The next morning, I had a strategy session with my leadership team. We walked through scale scenarios, risk factors, and cultural concerns. The offer on the table was clean, but the question wasn't whether the deal was good. It was whether I was ready. Ready to stop shrinking. Ready to be seen. Not just as someone capable, but someone powerful. Ready to become the version of myself that even I had been underestimating. That same week, Marcus called. This time, his tone was different, measured, almost careful. He wanted to meet, not about business, about us. I agreed. We met at a cafe near the lake. No suits, no laptops. Just two siblings who hadn't spoken honestly in years. He admitted the company was struggling again. Not catastrophically, but enough to feel it. Clients weren't renewing. Internal turnover was climbing. My systems were no longer in place to patch the cracks, and he didn't know how to stop the drift. I asked him if he ever wondered why things seemed to work when I was there and slowly fell apart when I wasn't. He didn't argue. He didn't deflect. He just said, I guess I never really understood what you were doing until I had to do it. There was no bitterness in his voice, just fatigue, maybe regret, maybe recognition. He said he was sorry, that he hadn't had the awareness or the humility to appreciate what I was building when I was right beside him. I didn't say thank you. I didn't say it's okay. I just nodded once, because it wasn't about being right anymore. It was about being real that night. I went back to my office, sat down at my desk, and stared at the investment proposal. I reread every line, every number, every term. Then I opened a blank document and wrote one sentence at the top. Do not build your value in a room that resents having to acknowledge it. That was my answer. I wasn't expanding Emberlane to prove anything. I wasn't taking investment to be celebrated. I was doing it because I finally understood that growth meant letting go of the need to be understood by the people who never tried. The girl they once saw as background support had become a founder, a strategist, a name on investor decks in rooms they would never be invited into. And the best part, I hadn't changed. I had just stopped asking for permission. 3 days after I signed the expansion deal for Emberlane, an email arrived from the Regional Chamber of Commerce. They were organizing their annual Economic Impact Forum, an event where industry leaders across logistics, infrastructure, and operations were invited to speak on panels about resilience and innovation. My name was listed as one of the panelists. So was my father's company. Same stage, same session. I read the invitation 3 times, not out of hesitation, but because I understood exactly what it meant. This wouldn't be a networking mixer or some private luncheon behind closed doors. This would be public, recorded, observed. Media outlets would be present. Professionals from across sectors would be in attendance. And every word, every gesture, every name tag would carry weight. It would be the first time my father and I were acknowledged as equals in a space that once made me feel invisible. I accepted the invitation without blinking. The event took place at a downtown hotel with tall ceilings, cement pillars, and the echo of soft, steady voices moving between badge stations and hospitality tables. I arrived 15 minutes early, not to impress anyone, but to center myself. I wore what had become my uniform-tailored navy suit, white silk blouse, no jewelry except the simple studs my mother once gave me when they handed me my lanyard. It read Mariah Riddlespringer, CEO and founder, Ember Lane Logistics. I clipped it in place and walked in with the quiet confidence of someone who no longer needed to prove anything. As I made my way toward the conference room, I spotted my father near the back wall, speaking with someone I vaguely recognized from a construction supplier. He stood the way he always did at public events, shoulders slightly hunched, coffee cup in hand, never drinking from it but using it like a grounding tool when he saw me. His expression changed for just a moment, not in disappointment or disapproval, just surprise, like he was staring at a version of someone he thought he had already figured out. I nodded at him. No wave, no smile, just mutual recognition. Moments later, we were both seated on the panel stage. The moderator introduced each of us, and when he read my title aloud, I heard a subtle shift in the room. Not shock, not awe, just a brief pause of recalibration. I wasn't the assistant anymore. I wasn't the quiet one behind the curtain. I was on the record. The panel opened with safe questions: how to manage volatility, how to balance automation with people. Then the moderator turned to me and asked, Mariah, your company has grown at a remarkable pace, especially in sectors where timing and efficiency are everything. What would you say is the key to building an operation that stays out of the spotlight but moves everything that matters? I didn't hesitate. I said, you build what people depend on. Then you stop waiting for applause. You keep your head down, your standards high, and let consistency speak louder than ego. I didn't look at my father, but I could feel the weight of that answer land where it needed to. The discussion continued. I shared strategies, anecdotes, outcomes. I spoke like someone who had been doing this for years, because I had, when the session ended. People gathered, cards were exchanged, appointments set. My father stood off to the side, still holding his coffee like a shield. When the crowd thinned, he approached me. You spoke well. He said, thank you. I replied. He looked around, then back at me. I wasn't ready for how people responded to you. He admitted. I nodded. I know. He shifted awkwardly, then added, you remember when you were 14 and I told you you'd make a great assistant someday? I do. I said, you said I was practical, not loud enough to lead. He let out a breath. Back then, I only saw leadership in people who looked like me. I missed it. You didn't miss it. I said, you ignored it. He didn't argue, just nodded. Then he asked something I didn't expect. Would you ever consider consulting with us again? Not to clean things up, but to build something real together. I looked at him, not as a daughter, not as a former employee, but as someone who had already outgrown his definition of success. I said, only if this time I'm not the person in the background. He nodded again, slowly, understood. That night, I stood in my office overlooking the city, watching the traffic flow like arteries pulsing through a living system. I thought about all the people who are overlooked simply because they don't speak the loudest. I thought about the quiet professionals, the calm strategists, the women who hold organizations together without ever being invited into the spotlight. Then I thought about that panel, about my name being called without hesitation, about the badge that no one questioned, about the man who had once told me to stay behind the curtain, now asking if I would come lead with him. And I realized something: I didn't need validation anymore. I had become the room, 2 weeks after the panel. My mother invited me to Sunday dinner. Her text was short, no pressure, just dinner. I didn't respond immediately. I stared at the message for a long time, remembering all the Sundays I had shown up out of duty while quietly swallowing the discomfort of being treated like a lesser version of myself. I remembered the comments about my outfits, the awkward silences when I spoke about work, the way Marcus would cut me off mid-sentence and no one would say a word. For years, those dinners had felt like a stage where I played the role of the reasonable one, the helper, the fallback. But something had changed, not just in how they saw me, but in how I saw myself. I no longer entered rooms asking to be liked. I entered knowing exactly what I brought to the table. That following Sunday, I arrived at the house 10 minutes early. The driveway was full, as expected. But the car that used to be a point of mockery, my quiet gray sedan, no longer felt like a symbol of not being enough. It was mine. It had taken me everywhere I needed to go. When I walked in, my mother smiled. Not the brittle smile she used to wear when trying to cover tension, but a real one. She said, "You look good." I thanked her and handed her a bottle of wine, not as an offering, but as a gesture. Marcus was already in the living room, talking to one of my uncles. He stood up when he saw me. That was new. He didn't hug me, but he said, "I'm glad you came." That was new too. We sat down to eat at the long table where I had spent so many years feeling out of place in my own family. The meal was familiar, the food the same, but something in the energy had shifted. No one made a comment about my clothes. No one asked why I wasn't dating anyone. No one looked surprised when I mentioned a new warehouse integration we were running in Kansas City. Instead, they listened, and not with that polite pause they used to hold between distractions. They actually listened. Marcus asked a follow-up question. My father nodded slowly, as if making mental notes. At one point, my mother placed her hand on mine and said, "I've been reading more about supply chains lately. It helps me understand what you do." I knew she didn't grasp all of it, but the effort was real. After dinner, while people were cleaning up, my father pulled me aside. He said, "I've been thinking about the last few months, about the company, about what it would look like if we started shifting ownership." I waited. He continued, "I'm not just talking about transition planning. I'm talking about equity, leadership, decision-making, something sustainable, not just something Marcus and I can try to hold together until it breaks." I stood quietly, watching him speak. This was not the same man who once told me I didn't have the presence to lead. This was someone beginning to understand that leadership doesn't always look the way he was taught to expect. He asked, "Would you consider joining us full-time, not as a fixer, not as a ghost behind the systems, but at the front, a real partner?" I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I told him I'd think about it, not because I was playing games, but because I had options. I had a company to run, teams that trusted me, a reputation I had built without shortcuts or family favors. I wasn't walking away from what I built just to make anyone feel comfortable. I needed to know that if I re-entered that ecosystem, I wouldn't be shrinking to fit it. I would be expanding it. On the drive home, I didn't feel triumphant or sentimental. I felt grounded, clear. It wasn't about proving myself anymore. It was about deciding where I wanted to place my energy, my time, my leadership. For the first time, I wasn't chasing acceptance. I was choosing alignment, and in that shift, everything else started to fall into place. The following week, after the dinner, after the nods of respect that used to be silence, after my father's soft request that I consider a leadership role in the company I was once erased from, I found myself in my own office with the blinds pulled halfway and my phone screen lit up again with his message, no pressure. Just let me know your thoughts when you're ready. I looked at the text for a moment, then placed the phone face down, not out of avoidance, but because I was different now. I was no longer the version of myself who would drop everything at the possibility of approval. I had learned to pause, not because I doubted my value, but because I finally understood how to protect it. That evening, I stayed after hours while the rest of my team filtered out. The hum of the city beyond the window, soft but constant. I reviewed our operations flow from the last quarter and checked in on our expansion schedule for next year. Everything was running with quiet strength, no applause, no chaos, just outcomes, just like I designed it. And yet, that lingering question pulled at me, not whether I could help my father's company, but whether it was still worth touching a structure that once labeled me as unnecessary. I thought about all the times I made myself smaller, quieter, easier to digest just to keep a seat at a table that now wanted me back because the cracks had finally started to show. But I wasn't angry. I wasn't even bitter. I was clear, and clarity has no appetite for validation. The next morning, I requested a meeting. No theatrics, no preamble, just a conversation in their boardroom, the one with wood-paneled walls and chairs that once looked so large they made me feel temporary. I entered with a thin folder in hand and sat across from both of them, my father and Marcus. I didn't waste time. I said plainly that I wasn't interested in returning to the company as a formal executive. I wasn't looking to be introduced as a partner in name only. I wasn't going to patch the ship from within, but I was open to working with them under Ember Lane's consulting division, on contract, through our terms. I laid out a clean agreement, scoped with deliverables, timelines, and licensing for proprietary systems developed through Ember Lane's playbook. No discounts, no family rates, just professional respect. The silence in the room wasn't heavy. It was necessary. My father turned the pages slowly, reading each section with a kind of focus I'd never seen him use when I spoke in meetings years ago. Marcus looked like he wanted to interrupt once or twice, but didn't. When they reached the last page, my father looked at me and said, "You're serious about this?" I nodded. I always was. You just didn't see it because it didn't look like what you were used to. He didn't argue. He just said, "This is strong. I think we need this more than we wanted to admit." I replied, "I know." Then I stood. I told them they had 48 hours to respond. I didn't leave a gap for emotion. I didn't linger for praise. I left because I had other meetings, other clients, other places where I was already seen clearly. When the call came 2 days later, my father didn't hesitate. "We'll move forward. Your terms, your structure, no adjustments. Thank you for offering this." And I said, "You're welcome." There was nothing else to say. That evening, I walked into Ember Lane's headquarters with a kind of peace I had never felt inside their company building. My name didn't need to be on their wall. It was already known in rooms they weren't even in. I passed the operations team and paused to look through the internal dashboards. Quiet, steady performance, results that spoke without a microphone. And for the first time, I realized I didn't have to choose between family and success. I had created a third path, one where I could stand exactly where I was, fully seen, and let them come to me, not with apologies, but with contracts. I wasn't back in the system. I was above it, adjacent to it, and absolutely essential to its survival. And that wasn't revenge. That was leverage earned through stillness, through consistency, through clarity. I didn't knock on their door. I built something better, and they had to call for access. Several months later, I found myself walking into an auditorium in Dallas to deliver a keynote on sustainable operational systems in legacy industries. The room was full of executives, founders, analysts, some from companies I once sent job applications to and never heard back from. Now, I was the one standing at the front of the room while their pens moved to keep up with me. I didn't wear anything loud, no expensive label flashing at the collar, just a dark tailored suit, clean lines, and presence when I walked on stage. I didn't feel nervous. I felt grounded because I wasn't here by accident, and I wasn't filling anyone's empty space. I was here because I built something that worked, something that outlasted assumptions, and the results spoke long before I picked up the mic, after the talk. I walked out of the room and checked my phone. There was a message from my father with a short update. The rollout is complete. Numbers are up. Your system stabilized 4 regions in under 6 weeks. Then a second line followed. Marcus wants to talk about shifting our onboarding culture. Says you were right about training flow. I smiled not for praise, but because it showed me exactly what I had hoped. They weren't just using what I created. They were changing because of it. I responded simply, glad it's helping. Let me know if you need an updated playbook. That was it. No nostalgia. No need to circle back emotionally. Just clarity. I walked outside and took a cab to the airport, watching the buildings flick past the window. I thought about everything that had unfolded over the past year, not just the career wins, but the emotional wins that didn't get posted, the boundaries I'd protected, the conversations I hadn't watered down to make anyone comfortable. I thought about the old me, who would have gone back for approval, even after being shut out. She wouldn't recognize the woman I had become, and maybe that was the point. We aren't meant to stay in rooms where our power is invisible. We're meant to build our own walls, our own teams, our own language, and if they catch up later, that's fine. But we don't wait for them to. Back home. I walked into the Emberlane office just before sunset. Our senior strategy team had ordered Thai food and was reviewing projections for the Midwest. The energy was calm, focused, capable. They didn't ask where I'd been. They didn't need to, because in this room, no one questioned why I was in charge. They just knew I earned it. That night, I sat alone in my corner office, lights low, staring out over the skyline I used to feel so far beneath. I remembered one night when I was 26, crying in my car after a failed pitch to a group of men who smirked at every number I presented. Back then, I thought if I could just be more polished, more agreeable, they'd let me in, but they didn't. And I'm glad, because being excluded forced me to sharpen, to clarify, to stop asking to be seen, and start building something that couldn't be ignored. I didn't get here by accident. I got here by showing up on days no one cared. I got here by writing proposals until midnight, by walking into rooms where I wasn't expected to speak and making people listen anyway. And now, I wasn't just being seen, I was setting the standard. I took out a pen and wrote a single sentence on the back of a meeting agenda. Sometimes the door stays closed because you're meant to design the blueprint for something no one else has dared to imagine. I folded the paper and placed it in my drawer, not as motivation, but as a reminder, because this wasn't a revenge story. This wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about becoming so aligned with your own worth that no one else's misunderstanding of it could touch you. The same people who told me I looked too small for leadership now read from handbooks built on my strategy. The same company that once called me replaceable now paid 6 figures to follow my process. But the real victory wasn't the check. It was the peace. It was knowing I hadn't compromised my voice to be heard. And now, as my story comes full circle, I can't help but ask how many others are out there quietly building empires, waiting for the world to realize they were never asking to be chosen, only for the space to lead.